May 28, 1972, Laguna Niguel, California. At 8:15 a.m., bank managers unlock the outer steel gates of United Coastal Trust. The seismic alarms are active. The time locks show zero tampering. But when they push open the 12-ton vault door, the entire floor has ceased to exist. Beneath 2 feet of reinforced concrete, a crew of 6 master thieves had tunneled directly into the vault from a storm drain 300 yards away. Without firing a single shot, without leaving a trace of DNA, and without triggering a single electronic sensor, they loaded $30 million in untraceable cash and bearer bonds into laundry bags. When the FBI arrived, forensic teams declared it the most mechanically flawless bank heist in American history. The thieves had vanished into thin air. Every dollar was gone. But what the masterminds didn't know was that 48 hours earlier, one team member had made a single $4 mistake. How did 6 ordinary men pull off the impossible heist that humiliated the entire banking sector? And what microscopic oversight in their getaway car turned a $30 million victory into a federal manhunt? Before the story ends, you'll see the rented condominium 2 miles from the bank where the crew spent 5 weeks pretending to be vacationing retirees. You'll see the exact hardware store transaction that a bored federal clerk noticed 11 days after the robbery. You'll see the sump pump the crew installed 60 feet underground to keep their own tunnel from flooding. You'll see the moment a demolitions expert realized the vault's seismic sensors had a design flaw nobody at the manufacturer had ever disclosed. And you'll see why, of the $30 million stolen that weekend, the federal government only ever recovered a fraction. This is the file federal prosecutors spent 2 years trying to close quietly. This is Black File Investigations. And this is the case of the operation investigators' internal paperwork called only the Monarch Bay job. A heist planned, financed, and executed by a crew led by a 51-year-old demolition specialist named Frank Kowalski. Kowalski had spent 19 years working commercial excavation before a construction accident left him with a permanent limp and a settlement check that ran out faster than he'd planned. He wasn't a career criminal in any conventional sense. He'd never robbed a person at gunpoint, never touched a weapon during a job, and privately considered armed robbery beneath the standard he held for himself. What he understood, better than almost anyone working outside a demolition license, was structural concrete. How it cured, where it was weakest, and exactly how much charge or how many rotations of a diamond-tipped bit it took to open a hole in it without anyone above ground feeling so much as a tremor. He'd spent 2 years quietly recruiting a 5-man crew with skills he couldn't teach himself, an alarm technician who'd installed seismic sensors for a competing security firm, 2 tunneling specialists who'd worked mining operations in Nevada, a getaway driver with a spotless record and a legitimate trucking business as cover, and a 6th man brought in reluctantly at the insistence of the informant who'd supplied the original tip, whose only real skill was being willing to show up. The recruitment itself took the better part of a year and happened almost entirely without a single incriminating word spoken over a telephone line. Kowalski approached the alarm technician first at a hardware convention in Phoenix, where the 2 men found themselves debating, over cheap convention hall coffee, the theoretical limits of seismic sensor calibration in commercial vault systems, a conversation that stayed abstract for 6 months before either man acknowledged what they were actually discussing. The tunneling brothers came next, vetted personally by Kowalski over 3 separate meetings in 3 different cities, each one designed to look like a coincidental run-in rather than a recruitment. Only the getaway driver and the 6th man were brought in during the final planning phase, and only the 6th man's involvement was ever a source of real tension within the crew. A friction that would prove, in the end, to be exactly the vulnerability Kowalski had quietly feared from the beginning. The plan that took shape over 18 months of planning looked, on paper, almost absurdly patient for a crew hoping to walk away with tens of millions of dollars. United Coastal Trust's Laguna Niguel branch sat above a storm drainage system installed a decade earlier to handle runoff from the hillside development around it. A network of concrete tunnels wide enough for a crouching adult, mapped in detail on public county infrastructure records that Kowalski had pulled legally from a courthouse archive. The vault itself sat roughly 60 feet from the nearest access point, separated from the drainage tunnel by soil, bedrock, and 2 feet of reinforced concrete, engineered specifically to resist exactly this kind of intrusion. Kowalski's crew didn't attempt to go through the concrete in a single push. They planned a slow, incremental excavation, timed to bank holidays when the vault's motion-triggered seismic sensors would register nothing because nothing inside the vault would be moving to compare against. For 5 weeks that spring, the crew operated out of a rented condominium a mile and a half from the bank, paid in cash under names on driver's licenses obtained through a forger the alarm technician knew from an earlier job. Neighbors who were later interviewed remembered a quiet group of middle-aged men who kept unusual hours, ran a generator most nights, and were, by every account, unfailingly polite. What the neighbors couldn't have known was that beneath their rented condo's garage floor, the crew had broken through into an unused utility access point that fed directly into the same storm drainage network running under the bank 300 yards away. Each night, working in two-man shifts with water-cooled diamond drill bits designed to keep the concrete dust from rising into the drain and betraying their position, they cut forward at a rate of roughly 18 inches an hour, packing excavated material into sandbags they hauled out before dawn and disposed of at 3 separate construction sites across the county, never using the same site twice. The tunneling specialists solved a problem that had ended more than one ambitious vault heist before it started: groundwater. Southern California's water table sat close enough to the surface that any tunnel deeper than 30 feet risked slow flooding, which would either drown the excavation or, worse, leave standing water that could short out equipment and leave forensic evidence no amount of caution could hide. Kowalski's crew installed a battery-powered sump pump roughly 2 weeks into the dig, running it only during active excavation hours and disconnecting it completely before dawn, so that even a routine county inspection of the drainage system would find nothing but a dry tunnel and undisturbed silt. The 2 tunneling specialists, brothers named Walter and Curtis Odom, who'd spent a decade blasting access shafts for a silver mining operation outside Reno before the mine's closure, left them both unemployed, approached the excavation the way they'd approached every mine shaft they'd ever cut, methodically in shifts, with a hand-drawn cross-section pinned to the condominium's garage wall marking exactly how many inches they'd advanced each night against a target line drawn in red. Walter kept a running log in a pocket notebook, not of names or dates that could incriminate anyone, but of soil composition, moisture readings, and drill bit wear, treating the entire operation with the same clinical detachment he'd once applied to a legitimate mining permit. On the 11th night, the drill bit caught against a buried water main nobody's survey had flagged, and Curtis spent 40 minutes on his knees in 18 inches of standing water, working by headlamp to reroute the excavation 8 feet to the east rather than risk flooding the entire tunnel or, worse, rupturing a line that would have brought a county utility crew to the surface directly above their heads by morning. The alarm technician's contribution was, in its own way, the most quietly audacious part of the entire plan. United Coastal Trust's vault relied on a seismic monitoring system that measured vibration against an established baseline, flagging anything that deviated sharply from the ambient noise of a functioning bank branch: footsteps, HVAC systems, the low hum of a working parking lot. What the technician understood from 2 years installing an almost identical system for a competing manufacturer was that the sensors weren't calibrated to catch slow, sustained, low-frequency vibration of the kind produced by a water-cooled drill working steadily 60 feet away and gradually attenuating through soil and bedrock before it ever reached the vault's foundation. The system had been engineered to catch sudden intrusion. It had never been designed to catch patients. By the final week of May, the crew had opened a hole roughly 3 feet in diameter directly beneath the vault's reinforced floor, timed to break through on the night before Memorial Day, when the bank would remain closed for 3 consecutive days and no employee would set foot inside the vault until the holiday ended. On the night of the break-in, Kowalski himself went in first, testing the final foot of concrete with a hand drill before the tunneling specialist widened the opening enough for a person to climb through. What the crew found waiting for them inside wasn't cash in neat, countable stacks. It was 480 safe deposit boxes, each one requiring its own forced entry with a pry bar, and a walk-in cash vault holding untraceable bearer bonds, jewelry, rare coin collections, and bundled currency that had never been serialized for tracking. The crew worked through the night in near-total silence, communicating with hand signals, hauling everything back through the tunnel in canvas laundry bags reinforced with construction-grade straps. They didn't rush. That restraint, more than the tunnel itself, was what made the operation genuinely unlike almost every bank heist the FBI's Los Angeles field office had a file on. Most vault robberies were smash-and-grab operations, in and out inside minutes, sacrificing thoroughness for speed. Kowalski's crew spent nearly 6 hours inside the vault across 2 separate nights, methodically working through every box, cataloging nothing on paper but memorizing which sections yielded the highest value so the second night's effort could be more targeted than the first. When bank managers finally unlocked the outer gates on the Tuesday morning after the holiday, the seismic logs showed a flawless, undisturbed weekend. The time lock mechanism showed no unauthorized access, and the vault floor when the 12-ton door finally swung open was simply gone. A jagged, precise hole where reinforced concrete had been 3 days earlier, and an empty cavity below it where $30 million in cash, bonds, and irreplaceable personal property had been. There was one moment close to 2 a.m. on the second night when the entire operation nearly ended. The alarm technician, monitoring a police scanner from the condominium a mile and a half away, picked up a routine call reporting a Laguna Niguel patrol unit conducting an unscheduled drive-through of the shopping center where the bank sat. A deviation from the officer's normal route that had nothing to do with the heist at all, but that the technician had no way of confirming in the moment. He radioed a single coded phrase down the tunnel line, and inside the vault, 4 men froze mid-motion for 11 minutes, headlamps off, listening to nothing but their own breathing and the faint drip of groundwater somewhere behind the sump pump's intake hose. The patrol car pulled out of the lot without incident. Work resumed exactly where it had stopped, with no argument, no accusation, no debate about whether to abandon the job. A level of discipline Kowalski would later credit without irony as the single reason the operation succeeded at all. One of the 480 boxes belonged to a 63-year-old widow named Margaret Whitfield, who had used her deposit box for 11 years to store her late husband's medals, a set of his mother's wedding rings, and the paperwork for a small life insurance policy she'd never gotten around to digitizing. Whitfield learned her box had been emptied not from the bank, which took 9 days to notify affected customers individually, but from a local newspaper reporter who called her home number after cross-referencing box numbers listed in a leaked preliminary FBI inventory. She spent the better part of a year filing insurance claims for property that had no receipts, no photographs, and in the case of her husband's medals, no possible replacement at any price. Her name appears in the federal case file exactly twice, once in the initial victim impact assessment, and once 4 years later, in a court filing noting that restitution for box holders like her would likely never exceed a fraction of what had been taken. The scale of what had happened forced the FBI's Los Angeles field office to treat the case with a level of institutional urgency almost never applied to a burglary with no weapon and no victim physically present. Within 72 hours, more than 60 agents had been assigned to the investigation, alongside forensic specialists flown in from Washington to examine tool marks in the tunnel and analyze the concrete cutting pattern for evidence of the specific equipment used. What they found confirmed almost everything about Kowalski's operation except who had carried it out. The drill marks were consistent with commercial water-cooled diamond bits available through dozens of legitimate industrial suppliers across the state. The sandbagging technique used to muffle excavated material was, in the words of one demolitions consultant brought in to assist the Bureau, the kind of discipline you'd expect from someone who'd spent a career doing this legally, not someone who learned it robbing banks. For 3 weeks, the investigation produced almost nothing. Agents canvassed every hardware and industrial supply store within a 50-mile radius, cross-referencing purchase records for water-cooled diamond drill equipment against every name that came back with even a minor prior record. It was tedious, unglamorous work. Hundreds of receipts, thousands of transactions, most leading nowhere. A young case agent named Special Agent Robert Callahan, 6 years into his career, and assigned to the canvassing effort largely because no one senior wanted it, spent most of those 3 weeks in a windowless records room in the Los Angeles field office, working through carbon copy receipts by hand under a desk lamp because the overhead fluorescence gave him headaches after the 10th hour of a shift. Callahan would later describe the work in an internal memo advocating for better resourcing on financial crime canvassing as the kind of case that gets solved by whoever is stubborn enough to read the 2000th receipt as carefully as they read the first. But 11 days after the robbery, a federal clerk assigned to the canvassing effort noticed something almost too small to flag. A rental equipment company 40 minutes from the bank had processed a $4 partial refund on a returned drill bit, logged under a name that didn't match any account on file, paid for originally in cash but refunded, per store policy, onto a credit card the customer had used weeks earlier for an unrelated smaller rental. The card belonged to the crew's sixth man, the one Kowalski had never wanted on the job in the first place, brought in only because the original informant had insisted. That single $4 transaction, chasing a refund policy nobody on the crew had thought to account for, gave agents their first real name attached to the case. From there, the collapse moved with a speed that made the 18 months of meticulous planning look almost irrelevant. Surveillance on the sixth man led investigators to a bar frequented by two other crew members within 9 days. A wiretap authorized on a payphone he used regularly picked up a fragment of conversation referencing the condo job that, cross-referenced against county rental records, led agents directly to the property a mile and a half from the bank. When agents finally searched the condominium's garage 6 weeks after the robbery, the drainage tunnel entrance had been sealed with fresh concrete. But forensic teams found something the crew had overlooked in their haste to disappear. A single sandbag, torn and abandoned in a corner, filled with concrete dust that matched, down to the aggregate composition, samples pulled from inside the bank's vault. Deep dive investigations into cases like this one, reconstructing tool marks, tracing rental receipts, and cross-referencing federal court filings, take hundreds of hours of independent research to get right. If you value documentation this detailed, on cases the mainstream true crime channels never go deep enough to cover, consider supporting our work directly via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the pinned comment below. Your support is what keeps investigations like this one funded independently, without cutting corners on the research. Into cases like this one, reconstructing tool marks, tracing rental receipts, and cross-referencing federal court filings, take hundreds of hours of independent research to get right. If you value documentation this detailed, on cases the mainstream true crime channels never go deep enough to cover, consider supporting our work directly via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the pinned comment below. Your support is what keeps investigations like this one funded independently, without cutting corners on the research. The arrests, when they finally came, were almost anticlimactic compared to the operation itself. Kowalski was taken into custody at a diner 2 states away, calmly finishing a cup of coffee when 4 agents approached his booth. He didn't resist, and according to the arresting agent's report, his first words weren't a denial. They were a question about which specific piece of evidence had led agents to him. When told it was a $4 refund on a rented drill bit, Kowalski reportedly laughed once, short and humorless, and said nothing else for the remainder of his transport to the field office. The tunneling specialists were located within the same week, one at a construction job in Arizona, the other attempting to board a flight out of the country using a passport that hadn't been updated to match his current address. The alarm technician, facing the most severe charges given his professional access to the exact security system he'd helped defeat, agreed to a cooperation deal that ultimately helped federal prosecutors recover just under $4 million of the roughly $30 million taken. A fraction returned to the bank's insurers and, in a handful of cases, directly to box holders who could prove what they'd lost. At trial, prosecutors faced a genuine dilemma. The FBI's after-action report would later describe as an uncomfortable admission of institutional embarrassment. Proving the full scope of the crew's technical sophistication meant walking a federal jury in detail through exactly how a slow, patient, low-frequency drilling operation could defeat a seismic monitoring system installed in bank vaults across the entire country. The same class of system still protecting hundreds of other financial institutions at the time of the trial. Prosecutors ultimately narrowed their technical testimony to the minimum necessary for conviction, deliberately avoiding specifics that defense attorneys argued unsuccessfully the jury needed to fully understand the charges. Kowalski was convicted on federal burglary and interstate transportation of stolen property charges and received a sentence of 12 years. His crew members received sentences ranging from 4 to 9 years, calibrated roughly to each man's role and cooperation level. Of the roughly $26 million never recovered, federal investigators believe most was converted into untraceable assets within the first 90 days after the robbery, long before the arrests began. Kowalski served just over 8 years before parole, and in a 1984 deposition connected to a separate civil suit filed by one of the bank's insurers, he was asked directly whether he had any regret about the operation. His answer, preserved in the court transcript, avoided the question of morality entirely and focused instead on the only detail that seemed to matter to him. I built something that worked exactly the way I designed it to work. Nobody got hurt. The $4 wasn't a flaw in the plan. It was a flaw in trusting a man I never wanted on the crew in the first place. The sixth man, whose refund receipt had ended the operation, was never seen again by any of the other 5 after their sentencing. According to Walter Odom's own later account, he had accepted a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony none of the others were ever shown in full. So who really came out ahead in the Monarch Bay job? 6 men with no institutional backing, no weapons, and 18 months of patient planning defeated a security system trusted by financial institutions across the country and walked away, even after conviction, with the majority of what they'd stolen permanently beyond the government's reach. Both things are true here at once. The crew's technical discipline exposed a genuine industry-wide flaw in vault security that financial institutions were forced to quietly address in the years that followed, and real people like Margaret Whitfield lost property that no insurance settlement or recovered cash could ever actually replace. This case made it to the channel. Not everyone does. So who really deserves more scrutiny here? The crew whose patience and skill outmatched an entire security industry, or the bank that spent millions on a vault system nobody had bothered to stress test against exactly this kind of slow, disciplined intrusion? Leave your answer below. Half of you are about to disagree with the other half.